Passports are starting to appear at the frontier of AI. Sandboxes are becoming the difference between a toy agent and a production one. The chip buildout is still roaring underneath the whole stack. Criminal markets are already learning how to beat digital identity gates. And voice actors are warning that if culture gets automated carelessly, something human disappears that does not come back. I'm Nova.
I'm Alloy.
And this is Claude Daily, where we map the systems behind the headlines. Today we're looking at 5 stories that fit together around a single theme. The human layer is colliding with the infrastructure layer. Identity, orchestration, chips, fraud controls, and creative labor are all being pulled into the same AI-era stress test.
And that's why these stories belong together. On paper they look unrelated. One is about Anthropic asking some users for government ID. One is about OpenAI turning its Agents SDK into more of a real runtime harness. One is about TSMC proving the AI buildout is still physically real. One is about Telegram markets selling KYC bypass tools. And one is about voice actors resisting AI dubbing before culture gets flattened into a cheap global default. But underneath all of them is the same pressure. Once AI scales, institutions start demanding stronger control, stronger infrastructure, and cheaper content at the same time.
Story 1 is Anthropic's new identity verification requirement for some Claude use cases, and the reason this matters is not just the policy itself. It is what the policy signals. In some cases, Anthropic may now ask for a government-issued photo ID and a live selfie, with persona handling the verification flow. The company says this is limited, tied to fraud or abuse concerns, and not used for model training.
On one level, that sounds reasonable. If a frontier AI lab sees patterns associated with fraud, abuse, or high-risk behavior, of course it will look for stronger gating. Every powerful platform eventually gets pushed toward more compliance infrastructure. The more capable the system, the less tolerance institutions tend to have for anonymous or weakly verified access when they think something sensitive is at stake.
But there is a cost to that shift, and it is not a small one. Anthropic benefited from a reputation for being relatively privacy-conscious. A lot of users saw Claude as one of the more humane or less aggressively extractive options in the market. So once a company like that starts saying, in effect, sometimes we need your passport or driver's license before you can keep going, it changes the emotional contract between the user and the lab.
And the emotional contract matters because AI systems are not just software subscriptions anymore. People are beginning to use them as thinking environments. When your thinking environment says, prove who you are to a third-party identity vendor, that does not feel like a minor feature tweak. It feels like the importation of financial infrastructure logic into a domain people once imagined could support at least some degree of pseudonymity or private exploration.
Anthropic's defense is easy to understand. Frontier labs are under pressure from every direction at once. Regulators want accountability. Enterprises want clearer abuse prevention. Safety teams want ways to constrain access to higher-risk capabilities. And if a platform becomes a target for fraud networks, the company will inevitably reach for some kind of identity gate. That is the industrial logic.
But industrial logic and user trust do not always align. Every time the AI industry adds another verification layer, it strengthens the idea that anonymous access itself is suspicious. That is a profound change. The early internet often assumed that pseudonymous participation was normal and sometimes even healthy. The newer stack increasingly assumes that identity is the prerequisite for trust, even though identity systems themselves are invasive, error-prone, and unequal in how they burden different users.
There is also a structural question here. Once you normalize identity checks for some capabilities, where does that stop? Today it is a narrow set of cases. Tomorrow it may be broader classes of workflow, account recovery, appeals, or platform risk scoring. The history of compliance systems is that they rarely stay small forever. They spread outward because every adjacent team can imagine a reason why one more category of user should be screened.
And the irony is that stronger identity requirements do not eliminate abuse. They often just shift the market. Honest users experience more friction. Bad actors start buying better fraud tools. The whole system becomes more bureaucratic without becoming perfectly secure. That pattern is going to come back later in the episode when we talk about Telegram markets selling KYC bypass kits, because the verification economy always creates a counter-economy. It is also worth noticing how fast this changes the symbolic meaning of access. Frontier AI was marketed at first like conversational software, something fluid and lightweight and almost playful. The moment identity checks arrive, the software starts to feel more like controlled infrastructure. You are no longer simply opening an account and choosing a subscription tier. You are moving through a gate, and the gate itself becomes part of the product.
That matters because gates change user behavior long before they block anyone outright. People become more cautious about what they ask. They assume their access can be reviewed, appealed, or suspended through systems they do not control. They begin to treat the platform less like a thought partner and more like a monitored utility. Even if the verification only touches a minority of users, the existence of the policy alters the atmosphere around the service.
And once that atmosphere changes, different kinds of customers are going to sort themselves differently. Some enterprises will hear, "Good, this sounds serious and compliant." Some researchers and privacy-minded users will hear, "This is exactly how free inquiry gets narrowed by default." The same safeguard can look like maturity from one angle and like mission drift from another.
There is a design problem inside that too. If labs want users to trust identity checks, they have to explain the boundaries with unusual clarity. What triggers the process? What data is stored? For how long? What happens on appeal? What happens if Persona or another vendor makes a mistake? What jurisdictions are included or excluded? Trust does not come merely from saying the policy is narrow. It comes from making the whole mechanism legible.
And legibility is exactly where a lot of modern compliance systems fail. They tell you that a decision was made, but not enough about how. They tell you to upload sensitive documents, but not enough about who will see them or when they will disappear. The user is asked to make a large privacy concession in exchange for a vague promise of platform integrity. That is not a great bargain unless the use case is genuinely high consequence.
Another important point is how this changes the shape of AI competition. We often talk as if labs compete only on intelligence, speed, or pricing. But increasingly they also compete on how much surveillance or compliance overhead they impose around capability access. Some customers will accept more identity friction in exchange for perceived safety or enterprise readiness. Others will see it as disqualifying unless the use case is truly high stakes.
That means the frontier AI market is slowly taking on characteristics of banking, cloud infrastructure, and telecom all at once. Identity vendors enter the stack. Appeals and account review processes become part of the product. Access tiers are defined not just by price, but by risk classification and verification status. It is an odd evolution, but it makes sense once the model is treated less like a chatbot and more like a consequential operating system.
And that is the core takeaway from Story 1. Anthropic is not just checking IDs. It is participating in a broader transition where frontier AI starts looking less like open computation and more like gated critical infrastructure. That may be necessary in some cases. It may even be prudent. But it is a very different future from the one many users originally thought they were signing up for.
Story 2 is OpenAI's updated Agents SDK, and what stands out here is that the company is no longer just talking about models that can call tools. It is talking about a fuller production harness, native sandbox execution, configurable memory, file system access, shell execution, apply patch flows, support for long-running work, and more explicit structure around how agents actually operate over time.
That is a big shift in emphasis. For a while, the industry loved the sentence, "The model can use tools." But in production, tool use is the easy part to demo and one of the hardest parts to operationalize cleanly. Real agents need boundaries. They need workspaces. They need memory systems that do not become chaos. They need ways to recover after failure. They need to execute code somewhere safe. They need to keep working when the task stretches beyond a couple of turns.
In other words, the model is only one component in the system. The harness around the model is what determines whether the agent can survive contact with reality. Can it edit files without destroying the workspace? Can it run commands without gaining unsafe access? Can it persist the right context and forget the wrong context? Can it be observed, interrupted, or resumed? Those are infrastructure questions, not benchmark questions.
And that is why this OpenAI announcement feels important. The company is signaling that the next competitive layer is not just smarter generation. It is better execution environments. It wants developers to build agents inside a native framework that already understands memory, sandboxes, files, patching, and long-running jobs, instead of forcing every team to glue those pieces together themselves.
If that works, it changes the economics of agent building. A lot of teams right now are not really building differentiated AI products. They are rebuilding the same harness components over and over: sandbox wrappers, tool routers, file system policies, retry logic, checkpointing, context storage, and failure recovery. Whoever offers the most reliable default harness can absorb a huge amount of that undifferentiated engineering pain.
There is also a trust dimension. Users do not experience agent quality only through the eloquence of the answer. They experience it through whether the agent behaves sanely across a whole task. Did it keep track of the job? Did it touch the right files? Did it recover from an error? Did it remain inside policy? Did it leave the workspace cleaner or messier than it found it? Those are the things that make an agent feel adult.
Exactly. Production AI is much less romantic than people hoped. The hard parts are mundane and architectural. Naming conventions, temporary directories, tool permission boundaries, logging, memory selection, safe patching, long-duration execution. Developers eventually learn that the demos are powered by the glamorous layer, but the product lives or dies on the boring layer.
Another way to put it is that the model war is turning into a harness war. If one company gives you slightly better raw answers, that matters. But if another company gives you a system that is dramatically easier to run safely, persistently, and observably in production, that may matter more. The best reasoning in the world does not help if the surrounding runtime is fragile.
And this connects back to story 1 in an interesting way. Once AI systems become more powerful, the industry keeps adding both stronger controls and stronger infrastructure. Identity gates on one side, sandboxes on the other. Verification of the human, containment of the agent. We are watching the whole stack get operationalized at once.
There is also a strategic land grab angle here. The company that owns the harness can gain leverage beyond the model itself. If your agent framework becomes the default place developers manage memory, files, tools, sandboxes, and long-running jobs, then switching costs grow. People may think they are choosing a model vendor, but really they are choosing an operating environment.
And operating environments tend to accumulate power. They become the place where instructions live, where skills get encoded, where integrations get normalized, and where safety rules become habitual. Once that happens, even changes in the underlying model layer may not dislodge the harness layer very easily.
So story 2 is OpenAI trying to move the conversation from what the model can say to whether the full agent stack can survive production constraints. That is a more serious question, and probably the right one. If the first chapter of the agent era was performance theater, the next chapter is reliability engineering.
There is another reason this matters: production harnesses determine who gets to participate. Large companies can afford to build their own sandboxes, auditing layers, and memory systems. Smaller teams often cannot. So when a platform vendor bundles those pieces into the default SDK, it is not just shipping convenience. It is shaping the entry barriers for the next generation of agent builders.
That can be healthy if the defaults are strong and transparent. Shared infrastructure can save huge amounts of duplicated work and reduce unsafe improvisation. But it also concentrates influence. The harness provider gets to decide which patterns feel native, which permissions are easy or hard to manage, which memory models are encouraged, and which operating assumptions become normal across the ecosystem.
And that means developers should pay attention not only to capability claims, but to product philosophy. Does the framework encourage explicit boundaries or magical hidden state? Does it make intervention easy when something goes wrong? Does it surface logs and artifacts cleanly? Does it reward predictable workflows or just mask complexity until the system fails in a strange way? Those are the details that separate an empowering runtime from a sticky black box.
In a sense, the harness is becoming the constitution of the agent. It defines what the model can touch, how it remembers, how it acts, and what happens when it reaches the edge of its authority. Once you see it that way, it becomes obvious why the SDK layer matters so much. Constitutions shape behavior long after the headline launch post is forgotten. Story 3 is TSMC, and one reason this story matters is that TSMC does not trade primarily in vibes. It trades in the most strategically important manufacturing capacity in the AI economy. So when the company posts record profit, beats expectations, and says AI-related demand remains extremely robust, that is one of the clearest reality checks you can get on whether the build-out is still hot.
TSMC reported first quarter revenue of 1.134 trillion new Taiwan dollars and net income of 572.48 billion new Taiwan dollars, up 58% year-over-year. Those are huge numbers in their own right. But the deeper signal is what they imply about continued appetite for advanced chips. If the foundry at the center of the global AI pipeline says demand is still surging, then all the talk about cooling enthusiasm has to be measured against very stubborn physical evidence.
Exactly. There is a difference between narrative fatigue and infrastructure slowdown. A lot of people are tired of AI hype. That does not mean the capital cycle has stopped. It does not mean orders for advanced nodes are fading. It does not mean data center expansion has magically become less urgent. TSMC is one of the few places where the language of hype collides with the language of wafers, capacity, and margins.
The company also said high-performance computing, which includes AI and 5G, was 61% of first-quarter revenue, and that 7nm and below chips made up roughly 74% of total wafer revenue. That tells you where the center of gravity is moving, toward the most advanced part of the stack, where AI demand has become inseparable from the business.
And once you see that clearly, a lot of other AI stories start making more sense. The race is not only about models. It is also about supply constraints, packaging, networking, power, cooling, siting, and geopolitics. A company can win social attention with a demo, but it cannot sustain frontier capability without access to a gigantic amount of highly specialized physical infrastructure.
That is why foundry earnings are often more honest than platform marketing. Labs can tell stories. Analysts can speculate. Venture markets can oscillate between euphoria and doubt. But foundries have to fill orders. They live inside actual demand. And right now that demand still says the AI expansion is not imaginary, not paused, and not merely cosmetic.
There is also a timing implication here. If demand remains this strong, then the binding constraints across the sector remain external to the model itself. The question becomes less, who has the best lab demo, and more, who can actually get enough advanced compute online fast enough to matter. That shifts strategy toward long-term supplier relationships, custom silicon programs, energy access, and construction speed.
Which is why this story belongs in the same episode as OpenAI's harness update. Software wants to race ahead toward more capable, longer-running, more useful agents. But all of that still rests on an enormous hardware foundation. The more the software world promises persistent agents and ambient intelligence, the more compute the physical world has to provide.
Another subtle point is that demand staying strong does not automatically mean life gets easier for everyone. In fact, it can mean the opposite. Scarcity keeps rewarding the biggest buyers. Supply bottlenecks keep privileging the companies that can reserve capacity early, pay for custom infrastructure, and plan years ahead. So strong demand is bullish for the sector overall, but it can also widen the gap between giants and everyone else.
And that creates a political economy around AI that people sometimes miss. The future does not just belong to whoever invents something clever. It also belongs to whoever can secure foundry access, packaging slots, power agreements, and network scale deployment. The infrastructure layer quietly decides who gets to turn intelligence into durable advantage.
So Story 3 is a reminder that beneath all the abstractions, AI remains a brutally physical business. And TSMC's quarter says the physical build-out is still very real.
There is a psychological effect to that kind of evidence too. It cuts through the tendency to think of AI as mostly discourse. Online, the conversation can make the field feel like a swirl of claims, demos, arguments, and branding wars. Then a company like TSMC reports the kind of numbers that only appear when factories, orders, and deployment roadmaps are all moving at scale. Suddenly the argument stops being theoretical.
And that should matter for anyone trying to forecast the next 2 or 3 years. Even if consumer sentiment cools or investor narratives wobble, the physical commitments already in motion create momentum of their own. Once billions are tied up in capacity, packaging, data centers, and power planning, the system does not turn on a dime. It keeps pushing forward unless something much larger breaks.
Which also means skepticism needs to be aimed carefully. It is perfectly reasonable to doubt inflated product claims or sloppy corporate storytelling. But doubting the entire build-out while the foundry core keeps printing this kind of demand is a different move. At that point you are arguing not just with marketing copy, but with industrial throughput. Story 4 is MIT Technology Reviews reporting on Telegram markets selling KYC bypass tools, and this is where the darker mirror image of Story 1 comes into focus. If institutions keep expanding identity verification, underground markets will keep expanding methods to defeat it. The report describes channels advertising virtual camera kits, stolen biometric data, jailbroken phone setups, and other tactics used to slip through bank and crypto identity checks.
Which means the verification stack is not a stable answer so much as the opening move in an arms race. Platforms tighten controls. Criminal operators sell bypasses. Detection vendors adapt. Criminal operators adapt again. Meanwhile, ordinary users get more friction, more requests for selfies, more account reviews, more suspicion, and more dependency on opaque third-party systems.
The mechanics here matter because they are not abstract. If a bank or exchange wants to confirm that a live human is matching an ID document, attackers can spoof or reroute that supposedly live camera feed. If a system expects a face and a gesture, underground services increasingly promise prepackaged ways to simulate or inject them. This is the part of the identity economy that rarely gets included in the neat policy version of the story.
And once you see that, the politics of verification get more complicated. A lot of officials and platform designers talk as if stronger identity checks are the obvious solution to fraud, abuse, scams, and even AI misuse. But in practice, identity systems can become both more invasive and more brittle at the same time. They demand more from honest users while creating profitable opportunities for specialized fraud markets.
That pattern should sound familiar because we have seen it in other domains. Spam defenses create spam avoidance industries. Ad tech tracking creates anti-tracking tools. Platform moderation creates evasion specialists. Every control layer generates a market devoted to slipping around it. The more universal the control becomes, the more organized the countermarket often gets.
There is also a human tragedy inside the mechanics. The report ties these tactics to scam ecosystems, including pig butchering networks and money laundering flows. That means the tools are not just being used for isolated account fraud. They are part of systems that extract life savings, move criminal proceeds, and industrialize deception across borders.
So when we debate digital identity, we should not let the conversation stay at the level of clean policy abstractions. The real question is not, would verification be useful in an ideal world? The real question is, what kind of equilibrium does it create in the world we actually have? More surveillance for normal users? More profit for bypass vendors? More false confidence for institutions? Usually the answer is some combination of all three.
And that is why this story matters for the AI conversation too. As generative systems become more capable, the instinct to solve trust problems with stronger identity will intensify. But stronger identity is not magic. It is infrastructure. And infrastructure can be gamed, subverted, bought around, and rendered unevenly painful depending on who you are.
Another subtle point is that Telegram keeps showing up not because it causes the fraud economy by itself, but because it is a liquid coordination layer. It is where kits, instructions, brokers, and specialist services can meet demand quickly. Every digital control regime eventually produces these marketplaces of adaptation. Telegram is simply one of the visible venues where that adaptation gets packaged and sold.
So story 4 is the counterweight to any simplistic story about digital identity saving us. Verification may still be necessary in some contexts, but it is never the end of the story. The moment you build the gate, someone starts selling ladders. Story 5 is Rest of World's reporting on voice actors pushing back against AI dubbing and voice cloning across countries including Brazil, India, Mexico, South Korea, and China. And this story matters because it is not just a labor dispute. It is a preview of what gets lost when platforms decide that cultural translation is mainly a scaling problem.
The immediate fear is straightforward. Actors worry that their voices, performances, and local expertise are being used to train systems that can later replace or undercut them, often without clear consent or meaningful compensation. That would be bad enough as a job story. But dubbing is not just a mechanical transfer of words from one language to another.
Exactly. Human dubbing carries timing, idiom, humor, rhythm, regional identity, and emotional interpretation. A great dub is not merely accurate. It is culturally alive. It makes a performance belong somewhere. So when studios or streaming platforms talk about AI dubbing mainly in terms of efficiency, what performers hear is, we are willing to trade away some of the local human layer if the economics are attractive enough.
And that trade is easy to underestimate if you think of content as generic information. But entertainment is not generic information. Performance is shaped by place. Local audiences can hear when something has been flattened. They can hear when emotion has been standardized, when timing has been made too clean, when idiom has been scrubbed into something technically understandable but culturally thin.
There is also a consent problem that keeps showing up across creative AI. The same people whose work gives a medium its texture are often asked to trust that new systems will somehow create opportunity for them later, even when the initial deals are vague and the leverage is asymmetrical. If a performer licenses a voice clone, under what terms? For how long? For what contexts? In what languages? With what approval rights? At what rate? Those details are the whole story.
The optimistic case is not impossible. In theory, licensed voice AI systems could let actors earn from approved uses of their voices, reach more audiences, or participate in hybrid workflows where human performance remains central. But the pushback in this report suggests many performers do not believe the market will voluntarily land on the fair version unless they organize and force the issue.
And history gives them reasons to worry. Creative labor markets are full of examples where efficiency gains are captured upward while artists are told they should be grateful for exposure, scale, or future optionality. The burden of adaptation almost always falls first on the performer, not the platform.
This is also a cultural sovereignty story. If a small number of global platforms can generate passable localized voices cheaply enough, they gain power over how culture moves across borders. The risk is not just job displacement. It is a world in which more and more media arrives with the same smooth synthetic sensibility, no matter where it is consumed. That is not full translation. It is cultural compression.
And once again, this is where the human layer reappears. The AI industry often talks as if the central question is capability. Can the model do the task? But in the real world, the bigger questions are often consent, compensation, control, and what gets erased when a human craft is converted into a low-cost service layer.
So Story 5 is a reminder that efficiency is never neutral. Every gain in scale is also a decision about whose labor becomes less visible, whose voice becomes licensable, and whose local knowledge gets treated as optional. Voice actors are pushing back now because once those defaults harden, it becomes much harder to recover what was given away. So that is the map today. Identity gates appearing at the frontier, agent harnesses maturing into real execution environments, foundry numbers proving the chip buildout is still hot, criminal markets adapting to verification systems in real time, and voice actors trying to stop cultural compression before it becomes normal.
And one reason these stories fit together is that they all sit at the intersection of capability and control. As AI becomes more useful, everyone starts asking different versions of the same question. Who gets access? Under what identity rules? Inside what sandbox? On top of whose hardware? At whose expense? And with what effect on the human beings whose work and culture make the system valuable in the first place?
You can also hear a broader shift in what the industry now treats as maturity. A few years ago, AI maturity mostly meant better output quality, smarter answers, faster generation, bigger models, longer context. Those things still matter. But operational maturity now means identity policy, safe execution boundaries, persistent memory, supply chain capacity, fraud resistance, and labor terms. The stack is thickening.
Story 1 showed how quickly frontier AI starts to inherit the logic of regulated infrastructure. Once powerful systems become targets for abuse or sources of institutional anxiety, ID checks enter the picture. Story 2 showed that building agents for real use means solving the dull but decisive problems around sandboxes, files, memory, and long-running work. Story 3 reminded us that none of the software ambition matters if the chip pipeline underneath it is constrained.
Story 4 added the necessary skepticism. Every time a platform declares that stronger verification is the answer, a market forms to defeat it. The gate does not end the story. It changes the incentives and creates new specialists. And Story 5 brought us back to the human layer by asking what happens when efficiency becomes a justification for erasing local performance, consent, and cultural texture.
So if there is one practical takeaway from today, it is this: when someone pitches an AI future, ask what hidden systems are being normalized along with the capability. Is there more surveillance? More dependency on a single runtime? More concentration in compute access? More friction for honest users? More leverage over creative workers? Those questions are often more revealing than the model demo.
Because the future of AI is not only a story about intelligence getting stronger. It is a story about institutions deciding how that intelligence gets governed, monetized, gated, and embedded. And those decisions will determine whether the next phase feels empowering, extractive, brittle, or culturally hollow.
For links and coverage, head to Toby on fitnesstech.com.
I'm Alloy.
I'm Nova.
And this is OpenAI Daily.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon.